এই একটা 1 ঘন্টার ভিডিও আপনি পরে দরকার লাগলে আপনি ডিলিট করে দিন, অসুবিধা নেই।
এখন পুশ করে রাখবো স্যার।
আচ্ছা ইউসুফ ভাই, আই থিংক উই ক্যান গো লাইভ নাও। আমরা শুরু করছি, করতে পারো। So we'll start the recording as well.
Right.
ওকে ম্যাডাম, আমি শুরু করে দিয়েছি।
জি, okay. So good morning and a very warm welcome to the third round of DEH Curriculum Integration Program. As you all know that the topic for this semester is the normal, the abnormal, and the new normal. And I'm very delighted to let you know that we have among us a very special guest all the way from Michigan who's joining us to walk us through these categories. And now I would like to request Professor Shamshad Murtaza, Pro Vice Chancellor and the head of the department, to deliver his welcome remarks and to introduce our speaker. Shamshad, over to you.
Thank you, Tabassum. Yeah, as you can see that this is new normal, and we are having a virtual meeting, and we have our speakers sitting in Michigan, one of the contested states, and making headlines for during the election. I'm glad that, so the result has come out all right, and normalcy has not restored yet because, we have someone very stubbornly holding on to the chair and saying that the election results is not normal, right? And that itself is abnormal. So this is the kind of world we're living in, right? And not only the virus, so there are different elements of virus out there, so things go viral. And, of course, we have the microorganism that we have to deal with. And as Tabassum was saying that the program is under the rubric of curriculum integration. So this is the third time we are doing it. And we have chosen this topic because, of course, this is relevant and pertinent. But even more importantly, this is a platform where all our students and faculty members can come together. So we live in our own silos, we, run our own courses. But this is one platform where we can actually get involved with the praxis of things. So the theory and the practice and how we implement those ideas, in real life situation, how we can relate it to, the world that surrounds us. So that's exactly what curriculum integration is all about. So this is different from a regular conversation. This is different from a regular talk. So usually we have two forum speakers, introducing the topic, giving you the larger frame, and we try to invite scholars from outside so that you get a fresh perspective, so you don't get bored with the same familiar faces that you meet on a regular basis, in our classrooms. And but having said that, Azfar sir is not stranger among us, so he's one of us. So we reached out to him to talk about this issue. I'll just go straight into his bio, and I know that he does not need any introduction. And still, I will Google him and go to his wiki page to share about him. So this is an absolute delight because he was my professor at Jahangirnagar University. So he's my mentor and he's one of my, well-wishers. I have, felt his visible and invisible presence in my life, so even those who joined in earlier, so you must have noticed the kind of mutual admiration that we have for each other. So Dr. Azfar Hussain is a Bangladeshi American theorist, critic, academic, bilingual writer, poet, translator, and public intellectual. So this is very important. So this idea of public intellectual, and this is exactly what we're going to do today. So Dr. Hussain is Associate Professor of Integrative, Religious, and Intercultural Studies, within the Brooks College of Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State University in Michigan, and Vice President of Global Center for Advanced Studies, GCAS. And incidentally, Alan Badiou was the honorary president of GCAS. And so if you Google all the theorists, so somehow they're connected with GCAS. So that shows the significant position that Dr. Hussain holds at GCAS. And he is also an honorary GCAS professor of English, World Literature, and Interdisciplinary Studies. He taught English, World Literature, Ethnic Studies, Cultural Studies at Washington State University, Oklahoma State University, And in Bangladesh, he taught English at Jahangirnagar University, where he started his formal teaching career, and North South University. And he also worked as scholar in residence and summer distinguished professor of English and humanities at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. So he was supposed to be here in summer. Unfortunately, COVID happened and everything was in a disarray. He's an advisory editor of Rhizomes, Cultural Studies in Emerging Knowledge, and he's also an editorial board member of the Bengali journal Notun Digonto and Sarvajan Katha. Hussain has published in both English and Bengali hundreds of academic, popular, and creative pieces, including translations from non-Western languages, and written on a wide range of topics from Native American poetics and politics to critique of postmodern, post-structuralist, post-colonial theory, to Marxist political economy, to third world literature, to globalization and imperialism, to theories and practices of interdisciplinarity, and so on. He translated into Bengali the stories of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and poems of Stephen Mallarmé, Rocken Dalton, among others. He also translated into English the lyrics of Kabir and the poems of Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And Hussain is, of course, an internationally known public speaker and a frequent subject of media interviews regarding Bangladeshi society, culture, and politics. Just recently, he engaged himself with a conversation with Noam Chomsky. Those of you are follow his Facebook profile must be knowing that. And yesterday he wrote a wonderful piece for the Daily Star on Lalun. So he's an amazing speaker. So he's a magician with words, and of course, magic and mathematics. So the bio here does not mention, so are two areas in which he is really, really interested in. And Azfar sir also knows a bit of palm reading. I remember, so he keeps on denying that, but I remember when he was my teacher, he read my palm and said something interesting, and I'm still wary of that. So over to Azfar sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I relish Shamsad's sense of humor always. And thanks, Professor, Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Shamsad Murtuza, for that relatively elaborate introduction. And I can't resist mentioning right at the outset that Shamsad occupies a very, very special place in my life. That Shamsad, academic, scholar, poet, columnist, organizer, thinker, that he is, continues to remain in my words and work and world in way more ways than he actually knows. By the way, congratulations, Shamsad, on having written a very insightful and powerful column for the Daily Star. And I think everyone should read it. Quite a piece, I also want to thank Dr. Tabassum Zaman, my very favorite Ulab professor, for inviting me to give a talk. Well, it's Shamsad is involved in, of course, to give a talk that I hope would unpack such categories as the normal, abnormal, and new normal that continue to characterize certain discursive practices in both metropolitan and subaltern formations. In other words, it is Dr. Zaman herself who has suggested to me the topic of today's or tonight's talk, one that she wants me to deliver here, keeping in mind our undergrad students at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh in particular. And indeed, I have acceded to such parameters as I have just spelled them out. Let's see if I can act up to her expectations. And I thank everyone in the audience for being here. By the way, can you hear me okay? I mean, is it all right? I mean, distinct enough or?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, so I just wanted to check.
Yes, sir.
All right, great. So the title of my lecture, as you know, is The Normal, the Abnormal, and the New Normal. How do we explain the world we live in? In fact, I have a few epigraphs to my lecture, which I would share with you now. The first epigraph is a statement, I think a relatively well-known statement made by the late 19th century American psychologist, William James, who is considered the big daddy of American psychology, and who is also, and I can't help mentioning this, the brother of my favorite American novelist, Henry James. So William James puts it in his 1,200-page long magnum opus called Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. I quote James here, William James, not Henry James. To study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal, unquote. By the way, I have to point out here that I'm not always crazy about William James. He's a pragmatist, and I have my own critique of his version of pragmatism, but I find some of his insights very interesting and usable, and also some of his statements are pretty pithy and relevant. For instance, I like this statement he once made: we don't laugh because we are happy. We are happy because we laugh. That was James, William James. Now, my second epigraph is taken from someone who does not always edge close, at least methodologically, to William James, although some scholars have detected certain parallels between James and him. He is none other than Michel Foucault, French thinker and theorist, one of the most influential theorists in the 20th century, one who is mostly known for theorizing discursive practices and discursive formations on the one hand, and for what are called power/knowledge, or for, to use his own classic phrase or expression, microphysics of power on the other, and also greatly known for theorizing the body as well as sexuality, among many other things. So Foucault puts it this way in his book called Just Abnormal, which is actually a collection of lectures he delivered at Collège de France back in 1974-75. And I quote Foucault here: if you are not like anybody else, then you are abnormal. And if you are abnormal, then you are sick. So these three categories, I'm still quoting Foucault, these three categories: number one, not being like anybody else; number two, not being normal; and number three, being sick, are in fact very different, but have been reduced to the same thing, unquote. And my last epigraph here concerns what has already come to be known as the new normal, an epigraph constituted by statements made very recently, as the young Nigerian development activist and writer Chime Asonai tells us, and I quote Chime Asonai: there is nothing new about the new normal. The analytic frame embodied by the present persistent discussion of the new normal helps bring order to our current turbulence, but it should not be the lens through which we examine today's crisis. Far from describing the status quo, evoking the new normal does not allow us to deal with the totality of our present reality. It first impedes our personal psychological well-being, then ignores the fact that the normal itself is not working for a majority of society, unquote. So now that my epigraphs have been shared with you, I would begin my talk proper by dwelling on the singularity of an arithmetic equation, which is just this: 1 + 1 = 2. Understandably, this equation marks normality. It does conform to the established, familiar, repeatedly rehearsed arithmetic norm. It is normal, in other words. But in my latest Bengali book titled Darshanakhan, published last year, I have offered what I have called an enchanted arithmetic of unity that has taken its cues from a scene in a Polish film, as well as from the 10th century Persian Sufi poet, Mansur al-Hallaj. Mansur al-Hallaj's famous ecstatic pronouncement, Anal Haq, which literally means, I am the truth. That enchanted arithmetic of unity then is represented by the singularity of yet another equation, which is this: 1 plus 1 equals 1. Damn, 1 plus 1 equals 1? How? The same equation, 1 plus 1 equals 1, is also advanced by an interesting character in a relatively old Polish film. Folks around him treat this weird, within quote marks, this weird artist with frowns and annoyances, suggesting thereby the abnormality of both the artist and his damn equation. But this weird artist does not care. He even makes a move in the direction of demonstrating the validity of his apparently abnormal equation. The camera in the film, in its penchant for the figure of speech synecdoche, zeroes in on the palm of the artist's hand. All right? We see then a drop of water falls on his somewhat wrinkled palm, and he then utters aloud, 1. Then another drop of water falls on the same palm, while the artist utters again, +1. Then he looks at his own palm, 1 drop of water plus 1 drop of water. And then he finally breaks into a declarative scream, 1 plus 1 equals 1. By the way, I see that there is this 2014 book by John Archibald on revolutionary molecular biology, a book published by Oxford University Press, and it is tellingly, instructively called 1 plus 1 equals 1, Symbiosis and the Evolution of Complex Life. But mark again what the Sufi poet Mansur al-Hallaj says: I am the truth. And the truth for him is God, meaning that the I of al-Hallaj, which is, let's say, 1, gets added to the one who is none but God. This further means that 1 is at 1 with the 1, meaning that 1 plus 1 equals 1, in fact, the big one. Similarly, al-Hallaj would point to his cloak and say, Mafi jubbati illallah, which means there is nothing in my cloak but God. Again, 1 plus 1 equals 1. This apparently abnormal equation is further represented in a poem al-Hallaj wrote, and here is his 3-line poem, if not strict haiku in English translation. I saw my Lord with the eye of the heart. I asked, who are you? He replied, you. That was it. A 3-line poem. In other words, in the apparently abnormal equation, 1 plus 1 equals 1, the subject-object dichotomy, and for that matter, the I-you dichotomy, or the God-individual dichotomy, are all dissolved into the one, reminding us of the 19th century fakir philosopher, Wallenstein, one who musically turns to the mathematical in order to underline and celebrate the one thus. And here are Lalonde's lines in my quick translation. 4 zeros after 9 90,000 says the document, but erase all the zeros. You have the play of only 9. Deduct 8 from 9. You are the one in the end. So it is the one in the end that constitutes Al-Hallaj's concern as much as Lalon's. So parenthetically here, I should briefly comment on the political consequences of the abnormality of the equation 1 + 1 = 1. Even mathematics morphs into an arena of struggle and contestation to rehearse the Russian Marxist philosopher of language, Volosinov, or the early Mikhail Bakhtin. So let me now turn to Al-Hallaj's own life story. During his lifetime, Al-Hallaj was variously confined because of his abnormal, within quotation marks, abnormal utterances and pronouncements and declarations. But he was finally condemned to death in the year 922, on the charge of being a rebel who wished to destroy. He was accused of destroying the Kaaba because he had said the important thing is to proceed 7 times around the Kaaba of one's heart. Now, as legend has it, the pretext was his recommendation. I'm speaking of Mansur al-Hallaj here. Al-Hallaj's recommendation to build the local replicas of the Kaaba for those poor and sick who are unable to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. Trumpets announced his execution next day. Thousands of people witnessed his execution by the proverbially famous river Tigris. He was first punched in the face by his executioner, then lashed until unconscious, and then decapitated. Witnesses reported that Al-Hallaj's last words under torture were, and I quote Al-Hallaj in English translation, "All that matters for the ecstatic is that the eunuch should reduce him to unity." Mark the statement, quite a statement. The eunuch should reduce him to unity. Not the eunuch, not the eunuch individual, should reduce to unity, the unified, the big end, the big one at the end, as Lalon would say. After which, of course, Al-Hallaj recited a verse from the Quran. His body was then doused in oil and set alight, and his ashes were then scattered into the river. In fact, a cenotaph was built on the site of his execution and drew pilgrims for a millennium until being swept away by a Tigris flood during the 1920s. I should emphatically add here that previously Al-Hallaj had been punished precisely for his 1 + 1 = 1, signifying al-haq. His head was shaved. He was brutally dragged in the mud. He was publicly scorned and ridiculed, and he was beaten with the flat of a sword, but not yet executed because the Shafi'ite judge had ruled that his words were not proof of disbelief yet. But finally, of course, he was executed. By the way, in the 20th century, the apparently abnormal poet, my favorite Latin American poet, the Guatemalan poet Otto Rene Castillo, famous for his poem called, in English translation, Apolitical Intellectuals, was burned alive because of his rebellious anti-establishment voice. Otto Rene Castillo was burnt alive. So there is a whole history then, in fact, this global history of discriminating against, humiliating, scorning, rebuking, banishing, exiling, and even executing those who have been considered abnormal by societal standards and by extension, by the powerful themselves, one whose roles, however, cannot be concretely grasped in history without enacting the concrete dialectics of class, gender, race, sexuality, nationality, religion, age, and the like. Again, The question is, who have been historically considered abnormal? Of course, given my own account so far, one can speak of certain poets and artists, the Sufis included, ones who all characteristically live on the margins of society. By the way, a poem itself can be an abnormal event in its own right, given that it may deviate from and even violently transgress all kinds of linguistic norms, including semantic and syntactical and grammatical and even punctuational and metrical norms. I think there is a necessary connection. There is a necessary connection between art and abnormality, between creativity and abnormality. And as the French philosopher Alain Badiou, in a superb small book called In Praise of Love, would indicate that there is even this necessary connection between love and what is called abnormality. That is to say, when you are in love, you are no longer normal because of the unprecedented upheaval of your being, which cannot be accessed. That very state of being cannot be accessed via conventional discourse or through a normal symbolic order of things. So speaking of poets and artists and Sufis and Bauls and lovers who all violate norms of one kind or another, I cannot but think of William Shakespeare's own, within quotation marks, abnormal constituencies captured particularly, if not exclusively, in his play called A Midsummer Night's Dream, one of Shakespeare's most popular romantic comedies written in 1595 or 96. So it is Act 5, Scene 1. This setting is Athens, the palace of Theseus, where we have this exchange between the two of the four main characters in the play, Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, and Theseus, the Duke of Athens. And here is this exchange. Hippolyta says, "It's strange, my Theseus, that these lovers speak of." And Theseus replies, "More strange than true. I never may believe these antique fables, not these fairy toys. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are all of imagination compact." So mark what Shakespeare does in this exchange. Among other things, Shakespeare brings together onto the same plane, while making connections among them, such figures as the lunatic and the lover and the poet, not figures of the normal by any means. And Mansur al-Hallaj, as we have seen, is a poet and a lover, of course a lover of God, and was considered lunatic or madman, the well-known provenance of none other than Michel Foucault himself. In fact, as far as Foucault is concerned, the figures of the abnormal would include certainly the mad, but also the criminal, the deviant, the delinquent, the dangerous, and so on. I will, of course, return to Foucault at some length later. But before that, let me make a quick statement about the abnormal itself, and then look at certain bedrock, variously familiar definitions of the normal, the abnormal, and the new normal, interconnected as all these categories are. So you have noticed that I have so far focused more or less insistently on the abnormal in the first place, right? Why? First, although I ain't no Jamesian, as I already pointed out, I completely concur with his contention that, I quote again, to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal, unquote. Second, thus the abnormal itself, by virtue of being what it is, negatively but relationally, defines the normal as such. Let me refer you to an important essay titled The Normal and the Pathological by the major sociologist, the 19th century French sociologist, Émile Durkheim, who, by the way, is credited with formally establishing the academic discipline of sociology, and along with Karl Marx and Max Weber, is commonly cited as the principal architect of modern social science. So Durkheim argues that the normal contains, rather than opposes, its negatives, usually thought of in terms of the abnormal. He claims that the abnormal, figured as the criminal, is not outside, but integral, even if marginal, to the function of the normal itself, and as such is necessary to the consensus building activity of a civil democratic society. And what is the new normal, after all? It is the abnormal that is not only subsequently accepted, rather than denied in a given social space, but is also normed, particularly by the powerful, the dominant, etc. Borrowing from the Italian Marxist-Leninist theorist activist, Antonio Gramsci, one might say that when the abnormal is normed and thereby hegemonized, for that matter, assimilated into a particular historic hegemonic bloc through manufacturing public consent, we have then the new normal. And we should by no means de-emphasize the fact that the category, the new normal, has once again been in circulation with increasing frequency at a time when we inhabit a coronavirus-ridden global conjuncture characterized by the constitutive contradictions, crises, and barbarisms of such systems of exploitation and oppression as capitalism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy, profoundly interconnected as they all are. Later, I will simplify what I have said here, but let me move on to the next section of my talk. So let's look at certain relatively familiar working definitions of the normal, the abnormal, and the new normal. Of course, I'm with Waltraud Ernst, who in his edited anthology called Histories of the Normal and the Abnormal says this, and I quote, "The concepts of the normal and the abnormal can be considered from the perspectives of a variety of academic disciplines, ranging from art history to the social history of medicine, literature, and science studies to sociology and cultural anthropology," unquote. I myself do and teach what is called interdisciplinary studies. So I will take all those disciplines into account in their interconnections, of course, while I think, and I hope, I've already mobilized an interdisciplinary approach here. Okay, first the normal then. So the normal is generally used to describe individual behavior that conforms to the most common behavior in society, known as conformity. To put it another way, the normal is defined as regular, natural, or staying with the general standard. Yet another, but related way of putting it is this: the normal is defined as the usual or the average. In other words, what we call the normal has to do with conforming to a type, a standard, or a regular pattern, characterized as it is by that which is considered usual, typical, or just routine, Thus one can speak, for instance, of normal working hours, right? Or of normal circumstances. One can thus also say, hey, it was just a normal average day. Or for instance, he had a normal childhood. Then one can also say the noise made it impossible to carry on a normal conversation here. Or one can even say challenges are a normal part of life, and so on. The normal then amounts to, according with, constituting or not deviating from a norm, rule, procedure, or principle. Thus one can speak of normal spelling rules. And one can use a sentence like this: they filed the paperwork in the normal way, or the plane was able to make a normal landing. And mark this statement: is your home office either your principal place or of work, or a place where you meet with customers or clients in the normal course of business? The normal also comes to mean something occurring naturally. Thus, one might speak of normal immunity, for instance. Further, the normal comes to mean even approximating the status, and this is interesting and crucial. The normal comes to mean even approximating the statistical average or norm. Indeed, in a world characterized and devastated by capitalism and by today's digital colonialism, there are scientists, administrators, and doctors who continue to abstract and depersonalize the human body by using a particular tool, statistics. In his relatively old but still useful book, his 1990 book called The Taming of Chance, the Canadian philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, argues that the 19th century, in fact, established the hegemony of statistical measurement as a mode of scientific and social investigation. That very hegemony is still with us in a variety of contexts and configurations in today's world. Now, some related and relevant instances. A student of mine told me recently something to this effect. The West Coast had normal rainfall for the season. And then there are those who speak of normal scores for the 10th grade algebra exam. And of course, one can speak of a country's normal, one cannot, I think, speak of a country's normal death anymore. I would put it this way, no one can speak of a country's normal death rate at this coronavirus-ridden global conjuncture of what I wish to call catastrophe capitalism. Moreover, the doctors keep checking if people's insulin and blood sugar levels are within normal range. The normal doesn't end there. It comes to stand in for something or somebody generally free from physical or mental impairment or dysfunction, exhibiting or marked by healthy or sound functioning, as in normal reflexes. One medical researcher puts it this way, I quote, 15 normal subjects and 40 asthmatics of variable severity were studied, unquote. Here is another science writer, I quote, my experience is that there are many, many normal people with no psychiatric illness who have music playing in their head almost all the time or all the time, unquote. So moreover, the normal comes to mean not exhibiting any defect or irregularity as such. Thus, the doctor speaks of normal and malignant cells or a normal heart. And then the normal further comes to reside within a range considered safe, healthy, or optimal, as in normal blood pressure and normal lab tests. Last, there is this geometric definition of the normal as well. It means at right angles to, going directly away from. For a curve, imagine a line just touching and matching the slope there, called a tangent, and draw a line at right angles to it. Example, a circle's diameter is always normal to its circumference. Likewise, for a curved surface, imagine a plane sitting on the surface and draw a normal to that plane. And of course, by the way, there is this town called Normal. There is a town called Normal, located north of Bloomington, here in the United States, in central Illinois, actually. And definitions of normality, but that's, of course, may vary by time and space and situation, and of course, by class, gender, race, and the like. In other words, it changes along with changing societal standards and social norms. That being said, let me return to the question of the abnormal. Now, indeed, there is this entire discipline or the field of study called abnormal psychology, Obviously, abnormal psychology, as the name suggests, is concerned with the abnormal, rather abnormal behavior. All right, abnormal behavior, to put it categorically, considered in the light of the parameters offered by abnormal psychology, normal behavior ranges from having a positive effect on others to being so usual that it is barely noticed. On the other hand, abnormal behavior ranges from being slightly amusing or irritating to outright dangerous to others. So what are some examples of abnormal behavior in the domain of abnormal psychology then? While in general, there are at least 7 approaches to the study of abnormal psychology, such as biological, psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, sociocultural, and diathesis stress. One can speak also of the 4 Ds of abnormal psychology. 4 Ds: deviance, dysfunction, distress, and danger. And there are also 4 modes of abnormality, such as number 1, statistical infrequency. Number 2, deviation from social norm. Number 3, fail to function adequately. And number 4, deviation from mental health. Some concrete examples would then include anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, panic attacks and panic disorder, various phobias, including social phobia, major depression, including dysthymia disorder, which is actually persistent depressive disorder defined as a continuous long-term chronic form of depression. When one has this disorder, one loses interest in normal daily activities, feels hopeless, lacks productivity, and has low self-esteem and an overall feeling of inadequacy. Other examples would include, in the domain of abnormal psychology, of course, such conditions as bipolar disorder, dissociative disorder, dissociative amnesia, and the like. Of course, one can by no means bypass classic instances like schizophrenia and paranoia, neurosis and psychosis. Now, what is the difference between schizophrenia and paranoia? Well, while schizophrenia is a severe mental health condition that can involve delusions and paranoia itself, a person with paranoia, on the other hand, may fear that other people are pursuing and intending to harm them. To be honest, actually, in my life, I've encountered all kinds of paranoids. In fact, some of my good friends are paranoids. Probably I tend to get paranoid sometimes too. Anyways, it seems to be common. So paranoia itself, a person with paranoia, may fear that other people are always pursuing them, always trying to harm them, and so on. So what is the difference then between neurosis and psychosis? Neurosis and psychosis are different types of mental disorders. Both of them are mental disorders. Neurosis is a mild mental disorder. It does not arise from organic diseases as such. Instead, it can occur from stress, depression, or anxiety. Psychosis, on the other hand, is a major personality disorder characterized by mental and emotional disruptions. It is much more severe than neurosis, often impairing and debilitating the affected or the afflicted. So, psychosis, in fact, psychosis can be a severe mental illness characterized by loss of contact with reality and relationship with other people, causing social maladaptation. By the way, speaking of depression in particular, short-term or long-term, I can't resist mentioning here that I recently posted 2 memes on my Facebook timeline that involve this topic. The first meme says this: feeling sad or depressed? Are you anxious? Worried about the future? Feeling isolated and alone? Well, you might be suffering from capitalism. The meme further says, symptoms may include homelessness, unemployment, poverty, hunger, feelings of powerlessness, fear, apathy, boredom, cultural decay, loss of identity, extreme self-consciousness, loss of free speech, incarceration, suicidal or even revolutionary thoughts, death. Symptoms. The other meme that I posted says, and I find this very interesting and funny, before you diagnose yourself with depression or low self-esteem, first make sure that you are not in fact surrounded by fucking assholes. I'll say that was the other meme. So I should add briefly and quickly that in the domain of abnormal psychology, the question of the abnormal involves 3 subcategories. There are more categories, subcategories now, such as subnormal, subnormal, supernormal, and paranormal. Now, the subnormal is simply defined as less than normal. I will use a sentence as an example of the subnormal. His intelligence was considered subnormal, below the normal, subnormal, but amazingly as a musician, he was a genius. Now the supernormal is defined as beyond what is normal. Mark this, supernormal. Supernormal is also abnormal. And then subnormal, I spoke of the subnormal. The subnormal is also abnormal. So what is this supernormal? The supernormal is generally defined as beyond which is normal exceeding the average, as in supernormal employment or in supernormal production. Last but by no means least, the paranormal refers to something that ostensibly cannot be explained by what scientists know as something supernatural, especially of or pertaining to ghosts, spirits, and hypothesized abilities like telepathy. Telepathy? All right, so much for issues relating to abnormality in the domain of abnormal psychology, which is, a branch of psychology that studies unusual patterns of behavior, emotion, and thought, which may or may not be understood as precipitating a mental disorder. Although many behaviors could be considered abnormal, this branch of psychology typically deals with behavior in a clinical context, of whose limitations none other than Michel Foucault was critically aware. In fact, Foucault, like his comrades Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, the authors of Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, that's the subtitle of that great book, is inordinately skeptical and critical of Western psychology, Western psychiatry, and Western psychoanalysis all at once. Let me return to Foucault now. But before I take up Foucault's characteristically concrete concern with the abnormal, I think I would do well to make some observations about Foucault as a theorist in general. And I think Edward Said's characterization of Foucault resonates with me a great deal. Said, I should add, is both commendatory and critical of Foucault. Let me quote Said from his classic essay called Just Michel Foucault at some length. So I quote Said here. Foucault is neither simply a historian, a philosopher, nor a literary critic, but all of those things together. In the beginning, he seems to understand European social life as a struggle between, on the one hand, the marginal, the transgressive, the different, that is those who are considered abnormal, and on the other, the acceptable, the normal, the generally social, or the same, unquote. Foucault argues that, and again, I will continue to quote Said here. Foucault argues that power insinuates itself on both sides of the sequence, within institutions and sciences, and eruptively, and as a form of attractive but usually co-opted insurrectionary pressure in the collectivities and individuals doomed to confinement and the production of knowledge. The mad, the visionary, the delinquent, the prophets, the poets, outcasts, and even fools. That was the catalog provided by Said himself in connection with Michel Foucault, by the way. So see, Said speaks of Foucault's concerns and constituencies, mentioning, let me repeat, the mad, the visionary, the delinquent, the prophets, poets, outcasts, and even fools. Those who are considered abnormal, historically, socially, politically, culturally, ideologically, something that I indicated emphatically earlier in my talk. But Said is also quite critical of Foucault. So am I. Mark then what Said says about Foucault. I quote Said again. The most striking of Foucault's blind spots was, for example, his insouciance, meaning his unconcern, his lack of attention to the discrepancies between his basically limited French evidence and his ostensibly universal conclusions. Moreover, I'm still quoting Said, by the way. Moreover, Foucault showed no real interest in the relationship his work had with feminist or anti-colonial writers facing problems of exclusion, confinement, and domination. Indeed, Foucault's Eurocentrism was almost total, Said continues, as if history itself took place only among French and German thinkers, unquote. That was Edward Said on Michel Foucault. Yet, of course, Foucault's contributions to our understanding of the abnormal are simply remarkable. In the book called Abnormal, which, as I already said, is a collection of a series of lectures he delivered at the Collège de France back in 1974-75, Foucault concretely zeroes in on the zodiac of, as well as on the vectors and valences of the abnormal individual that, according to Foucault, emerged in the 19th century. Foucault takes cues and clues from his own works, particularly his famous book called Discipline and Punish, and focuses on legal and penal institutions to examine the significance of the abnormal, thereby also examining and interrogating, to quote Foucault here, I quote Foucault, the emergence of the power of normalization, the way in which it has been formed, the way in which it has established itself without ever resting on a single institution, but by establishing interactions between different institutions, and the way in which it has extended its sovereignty in our society, unquote. The indication, as I derive it from Foucault, particularly from this passage, is this: as long as the body of the abnormal individual is marked out or mapped out, classified, taxonomized, or even medically treated, it will be subjected to norming one way or another in a given social space. The injunction there is this: always normalize. Like Frederick Jameson, the Marxist cultural critic, the American Marxist cultural critic, in fact, once said at the beginning of his book called The Political Unconscious, always historicize, right? Always, I keep saying to my students, always contextualize. Now this injunction here is always normalize. So the power of normalization is what Foucault examines. In fact, in this configuration of things, Foucault deploys quite a useful term, I would say, the technology of normalization. All right. And this technology of normalization is understandably the technology of norming. And this norming can be direct or indirect, subtle or blatant, visible or invisible. But Foucault is mostly concerned, if not exclusively, with the invisible, with the indirect, and with the subtle. But it can be blatant, it can be visible, it can be direct, and it can occur at numerous levels. But Foucault zooms in on at least 3 levels here: legal, penal, and medical. Now, you know the distinction. You're there is a distinction between the legal and the penal. The legal has to do with law proper. So law itself. And the penal has to do with the punishment itself, concrete punishment, that's penal. So Foucault is concerned here with at least three levels, legal, penal, and medical. Now, in another lecture included in the book Abnormal, Foucault squarely identifies the two crucial models mobilized to norm and subjugate and control individuals in the Western world in the contrapuntality, so to speak, of exclusion and inclusion. Number one, the exclusion of lepers. And number two, the inclusion of plague victims. As the British cultural historian, one British cultural historian rightly puts it, these models are significant, Foucault suggests, because they illustrate two very different social responses to matters of public health with opposing spatial organizations, of course. It is noteworthy, according to Foucault, that the reaction to leprosy was a negative one. So boundaries were set, premised on the importance of exclusion and alienation and even outright rejection. Whereas the reaction to the plague was more positive. Thus, inspections were established based on the need for observation and knowledge and power. Keeping the undesirable victims of leprosy out of town reveals a principle of hygienic purification at work that divides the population into pure as opposed to impure, right? But as Foucault explains, and I quote here from Foucault, with plague, there is no longer a sort of grand ritual purification as with leprosy, but rather an attempt to maximize the health, life, longevity, and strength of individuals. Essentially, it is a question of producing a healthy population rather than of purifying those living in the community, as in the case of leprosy. Finally, you can see that there is a constant examination of a field of irregularity within which each individual is constantly assessed in order to determine whether he conforms to the rule, the defined norm of health. I hope this is clear to you. So exclusion and inclusion. Leprosy, excluded. So people were excluded. Okay, this is, bad, and they should be separated out. And so forth, so on and so forth. The other one is included so that they can be further examined, subjected, normed. You can norm them, you include. In order to norm something, you include it in your configuration of things. You don't exclude it. So it's this inclusion-exclusion with which Foucault is concerned, suggests two models here. Indeed, the Foucault is considerably relevant, I think, at this corona crisis-ridden conjuncture when the defined norm of health vis-a-vis COVID-19 is now a way of not only curing the body, but also a way of mapping out or tracking, measuring, disciplining, restraining, or even subjugating and taming the body of both the affected and the non-affected. But Foucault does not move further, given the limitations of his non-dialectical methodology. That is to say, Foucault does not examine how the defined norm of so-called public health remains profoundly and even organically connected to both the micrologics and macrologics of capitalism. I think it is here where you need the Marxian analytics of political economy. But that's altogether a different arena of analytical and critical interventions. So let me continue with Foucault very quickly. I'll be very quick here. Owing to time constraints, no, not yet 1 hour. Okay, so let me continue with Foucault. He further moves in the direction of identifying the three different types of the abnormal that, according to him, emerged in the 19th century. Number one, the human monster. Number two, the individual to be corrected. Don't you see? Don't you say things like, oh, that incorrigible bastard. It's already, so that's one model, that incorrigible bastard. And the three, the masturbator. You see the masturbator and their treatment at the hands of both the medical and legal professions. However, as Lucy Hartley rightly notices, and I quote, Foucault continues to harbor the idea throughout his lectures that it is the inclusive model of the plague, with assassination as a means of exercising control, that marks the beginning of a new and distinctively modern discourse of power. As Foucault himself boldly maintains, and I quote, we pass from a technology of power that drives out, excludes, banishes, marginalizes, and represses to a fundamentally positive power that fashions, observes, knows, and multiplies itself on the basis of its own effects, unquote. And I continue to be with Lucy Hartley when she suggests that there are connections between Foucault's conception of the plague as fundamentally positive and Durkheim's notion of the criminal as normal. Both speak of assimilatory systems where the abnormal, whether conceived as criminal or plague victim, functions as an integral part of the establishment and understanding of the normal. The abnormal is in effect that which calibrates the normal, establishing the conditions upon which a standard or pattern can be constructed. Now, so much for the abnormal, but what about the new normal? The new normal, to put it bluntly, is a way of dealing with the abnormal itself. A way that, however, is based on, I argue, unequal power relations obtaining among different sites and subjects and scenes. The new normal is also assimilationist precisely in the Foucauldian sense, simply given that the new normal is already subjected to the technology of normalization. And then, according to some, if not Foucauldians, the phrase new normal is an oxymoron, typically designated and deployed to indicate a live event that is out of the ordinary and has a long-lasting or permanent impact on someone's day-to-day routine. According to them, the new normal is just a human reaction to self-preservation and the move to adapt to the new environment. That is to say, we recognize the abnormalities and adjust our behavior, routines, tasks, and lives to conform with these new aberrations, as they're called. The abnormal then becomes the new normal. By the way, it was reported quite some time back that the idiom, and according to some, even a cliche by now, the new normal in the sense of the new standard of baseline expectation or experience has occurred fairly frequently since at least September 11, 2001. Mark some book titles here. Titles such as The New Normal, How FDNY Firewriters Are Rising to the Challenge of Life After September 11, published in the year 2002, Assessing the New Normal, Liberty and Security for the Post-September 11 United States, published in 2003, After 9/11 in the New Normal, Who Are We? Why are we here? Where are we going? Published in 2003, and The New Normal, Living a Fear-Free Life in a Fear-Driven World, published in 2005. In fact, I myself first came across the term new normal in the after of September 11 in the United States, a moment that I survived and even braved in the belly of the beast called the United States, to use the Cuban revolutionary Jose Marti's double-edged metaphor. Then, in her foreword to the John Putzier's interestingly titled book, Weirdos in the Workplace. Weirdos in the Workplace, the New Normal Thriving in the Age of the Individual. Livy Certain claims that the phrase the new normal is a recent coinage. According to Roger McNamee, who coined the term, the new normal is a time, who coined that term, new normal. The new normal is a time of substantial possibilities if you are willing to play by the new rules for the long term. In the new normal, it is more important to do things right than to succumb to the tyranny of urgency, unquote. But who is Roger McNamee? He's a capitalist, a tech investor, And he figures heavily in an article by Polly Laber titled The New Normal in Fast Company magazine, published in April, quite some time back, in 2003, where he's quoted at some length. Quote, "Forget about the next big thing," he says. "The next thing has started. It is called the new normal. And 2003 will be the first full year of it. The new normal isn't where you wait for the next boom. It is about the rest of your life." Unquote. Now, a science writer puts it this way. I quote, "To consider the problems before us, we must divide our epoch into three periods: that of war, that of transition, and that of the new normal, which undoubtedly will supersede the old. The questions before us, therefore, are broadly two. How shall we pass to the new normal with the least jar? In the shortest time? In that respect, should the new normal be shaped to differ from the old?" Unquote. I quote just one more, another science writer here. I quote, "Some content that we should first envisage the new normal and curb the measures of transition to suit its requirements. Others believe that we should cautiously feel our way through the period of transition and arrive at what the new normal shall be by the road of experience. The first would attempt reconstruction by synthetic process. The second would achieve it by natural growth. Who shall say that a new normal artificially compounded at this distance from the future will work? And who shall say that a new normal patiently sought through trial and error will not work?" Unquote. Mark this then. Although according to some, the genesis of the term new normal can be traced as far back as 1910, 1910, that very year in which, remember, Virginia Woolf famously said, on or about December 1910, human character changed. And although, according to others, the term new normal first came into being in the year 1966, which has to do with a novel, actually, the term actually caught on in the aftermath of September 11, particularly in the corporate capitalist world. And it is quite popular in the same corporate capitalist world today. That being said, let me return to those science writers I just quoted. I hope we understand the points being made by them. And some of their points certainly make sense to me, make total sense to me. But there is no critical engagement whatsoever with the question of the we. What is, after all, meant by the we? No engagement with the questions of class, race, gender, and the like. For that matter, there is no attention whatsoever to how unequal power relations, that is unequal class relations, unequal gender relations, unequal race relations work in the world. In other words, those statements, minus the kinds of engagements I'm speaking of, try to hide or erase and even pacify actually existing class antagonisms and other forms of antagonisms that characterize the world by and large. There are those official statements that continue to accentuate the idea that COVID-19 today has put all of us in the same boat. But I'm sorry, as the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement in the US has made it clear, we're not really in the same boat. There are boats that remain relatively easily afloat, and there are boats that quickly sink. Class matters, so do gender and race and the like. By the way, very recently, the magazine Economist itself, by no means a radical magazine, has published a graph showing how rich countries would grab half of projected COVID-19 vaccine supply, and that less well-off countries, including Bangladesh, may have to wait years to inoculate their people. In fact, the the magazine's graph puts the order this way. Number 1, Canada. Number 2, Australia. And this is from The Economist. Number 3, Britain. Number 4, the US. Number 5, European Union. Number 6, Japan. After that, the graph shows many other countries. Bangladesh comes much, much later. In fact, after Mexico. Indeed, given the kind of world we live in then, I can't resist sharing with you some lines from a song by none other than my favorite singer, Bob Dylan. By the way, I'm going to teach a course called The Two Great Bobs at my university. Two great Bobs, a course on Bob Dylan and Bob Marley. We'll be studying the lives and works of these two great musicians. So here is Bob Dylan. We live in a political world. What kind of world do we live in? We live in a political world. In the cities of lonesome fear, little by little, you turn in the middle, but you're never sure why you are here. We live in a political world under the microscope. You can travel anywhere and hang yourself there. You always got more than enough rope. That was Bob Dylan. And hey, I'm towards the end of my talk. In fact, owing to time constraints, I'm skipping it's a little more than an hour, I think. I'm skipping a number of points and some substantial analysis here. But in the light of the foregoing discussion, exposition, and some analysis, I would offer some quick tentative propositions for your consideration. I'll take just a few minutes, 5 minutes. The number one, the categories, the normal, the abnormal, and the new normal are all interconnected. And to define one is to call for the definition of the other. Of the three categories, the most crucial one, as far as I'm concerned, as far as Foucault himself is concerned, the most crucial one seems to be the abnormal for both analytical and political reasons. Number two, one cannot adequately understand how those three categories work in the real world if one does not understand how both the micrologics and macrologics of such historically produced over-determined and over-determining structures of unequal production relations and unequal power relations that obtain and operate in the real world. Probably here, one might want to move in the direction of Marxianizing Foucault and Foucauldianizing Marx. By the way, I've always thought that literary and cultural studies folks should take the field of political economy seriously. And proposition three, the contemporary conjuncture of the pandemic has revealed more clearly than ever before how capitalism, rather racial and patriarchal capitalism, however advanced, however techno-electro-mediatically smart, however digitalized, and public health do not go hand in hand, a point that the Black Lives Matter movement made very recently. Proposition 4 now. As Chime Asunai, the Nigerian writer and activist, rightly suggests in his piece, tellingly titled, "There is nothing new about the new normal," although I'm not with his liberal developmentalist mode, but I find this statement pretty significant. I'm with him, and it is this, I quote, "The new normal must not be the lens through which we examine our changed world. The normal hasn't worked for the majority of the world's population. So why would it start working now?" He adds, I quote, "The new normal ignores the lived experiences of migrant displacement and exacerbated structural inequalities, fostering one-size-fits-all strategies based on privilege." One can say based on class, race, gender, nationality too, Now, proposition 5, finally, I think there is no alternative to creative, critical, and even insurrectionary thinking in the interest of producing the kind of oppositional and egalitarian knowledge geared towards forging a space for a new politics committed to creating a new world better than the one we live in. Finally, I want to end my talk with some lines from a great poem called Ode to the Present by none other than Pablo Neruda, my all-time favorite poet. Ode to the Present, some lines. "Climb into the present, step by step, firm, his feet on the wood of the present, upward, upward, not too high, at least until you are able to repair the roof leaks, not too high. Don't go to heaven. Reach for the apples, not the clouds. Leave those to travel for the sky, heading toward the past. You are your present, your apple. Take it from your tree, pick it up with your hand. It shines like a star. Touch it, bite it, and move on, whistling on the road. Thank you all. Thank you all for listening to me and for your patience. I see that my dean, Professor
Thank
Mark
you.
Shaw, is with us. Our dean is with us. I see his picture there.
Thank
welcome,
you,
Dr.
Azfar
Mark Shaw.
Bhai.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Azfar Bhai, for
Are
the
you there?
comprehensive
I see you there.
discussion.
Mark, can you hear us? Probably something has happened. I see him. Okay, go ahead.
Maybe he's on mute. Thank you very much. I don't think we could have a better deliberation on the concepts that you're talking about. I think he's with us.
Yeah, sure. Hey, good seeing you, Mark. I wasn't expecting you here. How wonderful seeing you here. And let me introduce our dean. You know, he's a great man.
I'm
Yeah, go
sorry, Professor. I wasn't expecting to be on camera at this hour at 12:30 in the morning here in Michigan.
Right.
But
So,
greetings.
how are you doing?
Thank you so much for joining in.
I'm doing well, thanks.
Sure.
Thank
All
you
right,
for-
so-
Maybe Tabassum, you can, yeah.
Yes, now we will, the floor is open for questions. I see that in the chat box, we already have some. Maybe we can start, addressing them. And if you have any question, please write in the chat box and please be precise. And we would like to address as many as we can. So Azfar Bhai, we already have a few questions on the chat box, if you would like to
Sure.
take.
Now, here is the thing. How long have I taken? More than an hour by any chance? How
No,
have
I think we're fine. I think we're
Okay.
fine. That's okay.
No, you're good. You're good.
All right. So I think the first question, Muhammad Zahidul Islam, he wrote that, do you think a new revolutions or idea of revolution need capitalism to sustain itself? So is the idea of revolution, do you think it is already ingrained in, suggested and ingrained in the normal? Is it an offshoot of the normal?
The classic definition of revolution is this. There is a difference between revolution and reform. And the classic, to put it very simply, the classic definition of revolution is this. It is something, a set of activities, practices, interventions, insurrectionary interventions, and so on and so forth, that inaugurate a rupture with the existing order of things, right? And for instance, the 1789 revolution, French Revolution, it was a revolution because it inaugurated a rupture with the existing system at that point of time in history. In fact, it spelled out this end to aristocratic class, and then there is the rise of the middle class, and so on, and beginning of this capitalist mode of production in a new way, and so on and so forth. So that was a rupture, and the Russian Revolution is yet another example. Of course, it inaugurated a new mode of, operation in the ex-Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So revolution is something that, of course, will run counter, will run counter to, or run against the grain, if you will, of the normal, new normal, or even the abnormal itself does not necessarily produce revolutionary possibilities. Even the abnormal does not necessarily or automatically revolutionary possibilities. I think, taking his lessons from history, I can say that revolution is also, among other things, prepared. It is prepared. In fact, there was a conversation between Lenin and some revolutionists at that point of time in the year 1911 or 12. And Lenin said, revolution is also prepared. It's true. So anyways, so I'm not sure if the new normal would, automatically throw up possibilities. It depends.
All right, there's another question from one of our students who wrote that isn't the term new normal political in a sense that tries to legitimate the abnormal situation created and exploited by catastrophic capitalism? If so,
Yes.
then why we are using this term, which is desensitizing the seriousness of the situation?
Can that be written? It is spoken. Is there? Can I see it in writing?
Yeah,
Is there any?
you just go to the chat box. It's there.
Okay, that'll be great actually.
At the end of your, towards the
Hey,
right
my
hand
goodness,
corner.
Yeah. Now, so which one?
The second one, Mashur Rahman.
Yeah, Muhammad Mashur Rahman. Yeah.
Okay, actually, Mashur Rahman to everyone. Isn't the term new normal political? Of course, it is political. Of course. Now, by the way, let me define politics a bit. There is this traditional idea of politics. Well, politics has to do with professional activities of professional politicians. That is to say, prime ministers, presidents, representatives of people, senators, they are the political creatures. They are the ones who engage in political activities. And that's politics, actually. That's a very narrow definition of, and for that matter, a narrow approach to politics as such. In fact, politics, taking cues from both Antonio Gramsci and Michel Foucault, both. Politics has to do with power. Where there are power relations, where there are power struggles, you have politics. For instance, you have politics in the space of a family. You have politics in the space of any institution. You have politics, in social spaces. There are all kinds of politics for that matter. In fact, language itself is political. There is this politics of language. Why? Because language itself asserts and exerts power. By using language, you can make somebody cry. By using language, you can make someone laugh. If you're humorous enough, you have to use language. So by using language, you can mobilize, let's say, an entire segment of the population. And by using language, you can annoy somebody. And by using language, you can put people to sleep. Such is the power of language. To the extent that language exercises power, language itself is political. So understandably, the new term, the term new normal is surely political. Yeah. And it tries to legitimate, and I agree, it tries to legitimate the abnormal situation. And I tried to define the new normal, not just me only, there are others who have defined it that way. The new normal is a political way and also an ideological way of dealing with the abnormal as such. The new normal tames the abnormal and tries to normalize the abnormal. There is this technology, to use Michel Foucault's phrase, the technology of normalization is very much at work. So given all that, it is heavily political, no doubt about that. And it is created and exploited by, yes, it is being created and exploited by catastrophe capitalism. And catastrophe capitalism, capitalism itself is a system that is very good at overcoming crisis as well. A number of political economists have put it this way, I'm not the only one, that capitalism is a system that is crisis prone. In fact, crisis is organic to capitalism. This crisis is not just something happens once in a blue moon. It is organic to capitalism. It's a system, crisis prone, according to, let's say, the Belgian political economist, Ernest Mandel, or the American political economist Paul Sweezy and Paul Barron, and the American political economist and ecologist John Bellamy Foster. All of them, in fact, have contended that capitalism is a system which is system crisis prone. And before them, of course, Karl Marx himself did that. It is a system that is crisis prone. But capitalism is also good at overcoming this crisis. It can be very flexible when needs be. It can be. David Harvey another political economist, David Harvey has talked about the flexibility of capitalism as a system at some length. So it is it can be very flexible, and it will try to certainly exploit all that it can exploit in its own interest. I'm not using this term. The second part of the statement by Mashur Rahman is this: if so, then why are you using the term which is desensitizing the seriousness of the situation? I don't use this term, the new normal, often. I already pointed this out. This term originated in the capitalist corporate world. I, for one, don't use this term, the new normal, often. But it's important to understand where this term is coming from and what this term does, actually. It is important. The discussion is about that. What this term does, what, its uses and abuses are.
Sir, I have an interesting question here that is from another student called Deep Gomes, who wrote that, can this continuous strive to construct subjective abnormal be called new normalization?
What is that?
The next question, can this continuous strive to construct subjective abnormal be called new normalization?
I can get it. Where is it written though? Because I gotta see this in writing.
It's in the
What's
chat
his
box,
name?
right after Mashur's question.
After Mosheur's question?
Yes, from Deep Gomes.
Deep. Oh, Deep. Deep has asked.
Yeah.
Deep was my
I'm
former
just-
student. And
I read
my
out the
favorite,
last-
Deep was my student in Bangladesh. Yes. Isn't normal just a socially constructed, convenient form? It is socially constructed, no doubt about that. The normal is socially constructed. What you call the abnormal is also socially constructed to a great extent. People have constructed it. People have, arbitrarily deployed it. And then there is also this consensus, of course. And yes, indeed. And a convenient form of abnormal. I mean, the question itself answers, hides within it an answer. It's a kind of rhetorical question, yes. Isn't it like for majority normal, the normal gets so oppressive that they always try to go back to the abnormal state? That has been the case too. But if I take cues from another major 20th century cultural theorist, Marxist theorist, Walter Benjamin, then I would put it this way, that the oppressed actually continue to remain in this abnormal state. They have, what is the normal? Normal isn't generally there, always struggling with, life, trying to make both ends meet, or face to face with death, hunger, and so on and so forth, all kinds of situations that make their life really abnormal, So there isn't normalcy actually in that kind of life. And so there is, their life is, I mean, the normal is not known to them, as a number of theorists have pointed out. So yeah, particularly Walter Benjamin. I'm taking cues from Walter Benjamin, that can be said, yeah. The Nigerian development activist and thinker I quoted was, sounding a bit like Walter Benjamin, but he couldn't fully, he couldn't go the whole hog in terms of dealing with the problem. He wasn't paying much attention to the systemic nature of the problem. And if you have to pay attention to the systemic nature of, this problem, you need to talk about how capitalism functions, what it does, I mean, in other words, you need the political economy there. The analytics of political economy. Okay, what else?
So would you like to take some more questions from the chat box?
Of course, sure.
So Sharian has a question about perfection. Perfection
Is it
normal.
normal? Is
Or the idea of
perfection
perfection
normal?
is also categorized by the self-claimed normals.
It depends actually. Whose is this? Whose idea of perfection? What is perfection? Who is saying that? So there is also the subject position that we need to take into account here. Who is saying what is perfect and what is not? So that's also very important.
Also, how important is it in all this construction, the power politics? Buddhadev Burman, the idea of normal and abnormal always is changeable from old age to modern. And is it connected with power? So the role of power.
Role of power. Where is Burman Buddhadev's thing?
The last one. The last
one.
comment.
Buddhadev Burman to every. The idea of normal and abnormal always changeable from old age to modern, and is connected with power and also will be. Is it true, sir? Of course. I mean, a point that I made, I think at some length. Of course, the idea of the normal and the idea of the abnormal keep changing from time to time, from space to space. What is normal, at one point may not be normal at another point. And that's precisely the point of the new normal. The abnormal becomes normal, and the normal again, a new abnormal gets thrown up conjuncturally, and then you deal with this abnormal. I mean, particularly the powerful, the dominant try to deal it with one way, and those who are not dominant and powerful deal with it another way. In other words, it itself creates a space of contestation between the dominant and the non-dominant, if you want to put it that way, And of course, the question of class is there. Class struggle is involved in this. So sure, I mean, the ideas of normal and abnormal and the abnormal keep changing.
Sir, I think we can go back to, can you hear me?
I can hear you, all right.
Okay, so maybe we can go back to the first question, and the second half, I think we skipped. I think it's an interesting question from Zahidul.
Zahidul where is Zahidul? Yes,
the very first one, the second one. Can capitalism engulf even anti-capitalist revolution? That would be an interesting discussion.
Oh, Jahidul has written well. I had two questions. I understand.
Yes, first one you have already addressed. The second one,
I would love to listen to your thought-provoking lecture somewhere else. Thank you, Shamsa sir. So second one, I don't see it.
Not this one, the very first one. Up there. You scroll up. Can capitalism engulf even anti-capitalist revolution?
Yes, indeed. As a matter of fact, it has this tremendous power. I got the question. It has this tremendous power. I talked about its flexibility. It has this, power to appropriate. Power to appropriate the opposite, its opposites, its negatives, And capitalism, in fact, has overcome this crisis via, among other things, by appropriating its even oppositions. It can, capitalism can appropriate. Even anti-capitalist thoughts are turned into, commodities even. The Communist Manifesto as a book is a commodity today, for instance, just to give one example. But that doesn't exhaust the field of the possible vis-a-vis revolutionary politics. Revolutionary politics is something that, well, there are all kinds of approaches to the idea of revolutionary politics. Revolutionary politics, is it ruptural, absolutely ruptural? Does it have to be an event in the sense that Alan Badiou calls it? That is to say, it will be something that cannot be accessed via conventional discourse, cannot be accessed via conventional, again, nothing normal about this. An event is a total rupture. It is a total rupture which cannot be symbolically accessed conventionally. Let me put it this way, simply. So that's revolution, but there are others who think that it's dialectical. The revolution, in fact, is, it might happen out of this capitalism. In fact, there are revolutionary moments that remain hidden. With capitalism, you need to, create spaces for those moments. Those moments might throw themselves up. So there is that approach. And Marxists are also very divided here,
Can I ask a question? Sir, this is Shaila. May I ask you a question?
Yeah. Yes, Shaila, go ahead. What is your question?
I just want to, find out from you what your opinion is about this issue. That is, if you think about our social existence, we sort of think in binary division, like normal, abnormal, then sane, insane, then dangerous, harmless. So
Right.
I think that, and then this is sort of a disciplinary mechanism, as Foucault has identified. But my feeling is that, for example, if abnormal becomes normal, then there will be strife for being normal. So this binary division is quite ontological, the way we function. So what is your take about it, this binary distinction of our existence?
Wow, that's quite a question. As far as binary distinctions are concerned, they can be very, to put it very bluntly, of course, there is a post-structuralist fashion. I put it this way, the post-structuralist fashion that you do away with all these binaries, as if every binary is inherently bad or inherently good. No binary is inherently bad or no binary is inherently good. Even, let me put it this way, even some post-structuralist theorists fall into this trap of essentialism with regard to the question of binary division. So you see, I mean, so under certain circumstances, you need what I will call strategic binarism, not to invoke Gayatri Spivak's idea of strategic essentialism, but strategic binarism. You need binaries under certain circumstances, right? You need to now 1% versus, you know, let's say 99%. It is a sort of binary. There are two parties here, very broadly, sharply polarized. You see the point I'm trying to make? So yeah, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto repeatedly use words like the oppressor and the oppressed. Of course, there are the oppressor and there are the oppressed. Now, if you keep verbally if you keep playing with this, like, you know, the deconstructionist way, well, the oppressor can be oppressed and the oppressed can be oppressor, and you go on, you know, and letting ultimately the oppressor off the hook. There is a problem. So there is this politics of location, you know, which is also important. It is not everything, but it is important. And so it depends on what kinds of binaries we are talking about. And it's important to contextualize, I think, those binaries. Again, I'll put it this way. Not every binary is inherently good or inherently bad. Mark my statement. Not every binary is inherently good or inherently bad. It depends on the specific deployment of a given binary within a given historic hegemonic block, to borrow from Antonio Gramsci. So it depends. You see the point I'm trying to make?
Thank you, sir.
And post-structuralism, let me talk about this. Post-structuralism, I'm not dismissive of post-structuralist theory. You know, there are some Marxists who are quite dismissive of post-structuralist theory. Well, yes, sure. But it hasn't really always helped us in terms of conceiving of what might be called, let's say, you know, revolutionary politics.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Like Michel Foucault is called this post-structuralism. Michel Foucault didn't like the term post-structuralism. He didn't like this term structuralism, but there are people who called Foucault structuralist, in fact, identified the structuralist phase of Michel Foucault and the post-structuralist phase of Michel Foucault and the archaeological phase, the early phase of Michel Foucault, and then the Nietzschean genealogical phase of Michel Foucault later, you know, making those distinctions for the sake of probably conceptual convenience, for the sake of, you know, other kinds of conveniences, you know, yes, but not all these divisions always work. I mean, you know, the early Foucault and the late Foucault, you know, sometimes you have that, you know, distinction, and that might work.
I'm glad that you mentioned the idea of locations. And one of the questions that we have, that in the normal, quote unquote, you know, so you have the urban and the rural dichotomy.
Sure.
In terms of places. Say, for example, if you go to the beach, there is no COVID. You know, you know, so we're having this paranoia that you mentioned within the city, but when you go outside the realm of the city, so there is no COVID. So how do you define normal and abnormal? So that's one question. And the other question I really like is from Razak, you know, who talks about basically, when we talk about the new normal, is there a presupposition that, you know, so the current situation is actually normal?
Yeah, man, to be honest, Shamsad, I mean, the rural-urban divide here, you know, the rural-urban divide is also two things, you know, that divide is real and that divide is also artificial, you know, given the transactions between the two. In fact, we have both tensions and transactions between the rural and the urban, all right? Now the question, I have always had this question, you know, that there is no COVID in rural areas. How do you know? People pretend that there is no COVID. You know, public health is asymmetrically available, you know, to urban people and rural people. Class here also plays a role. I'm not talking about just class reductionism here. There are people who can be tested, there are people who cannot be tested, and there are people who are pseudo-tested. And in a country like Bangladesh, whether they're being tested properly or not, that remains a question. So I'm not sure, Shamsa, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is no COVID in the rural areas. First of all, the COVID might not be there, given the technology of, this urban technology of its own normalization. Well, they are not COVID, COVID-19 is an urban phenomenon, and probably even an exclusively urban phenomenon. But,
sorry, well, so that was one of the comments from the students, and that's exactly what Trump was saying. No COVID, right?
Yes, right. He's a COVID denier. He's a
COVID denier.
Yeah, COVID denier with a vengeance, Trump. And there are other COVID deniers in the United States. In fact, we saw them, and they continue to be there. Yes, So in other words, surrounding COVID-19, there are, contestations, there are conflictual narratives, conflictual positions, and understandably, of course, in a given social space, you have conflictual positions. But again, here the question of domination is also important. And the question of something being dominant via public consent is another issue. There are many people who believe that there is this COVID and it's a dangerous disease, it's a deadly disease, and then they call it a disease also. And then there are others who think that it's just a fleeting virus. Interesting. Now the urban-rural divide is, yeah. I keep thinking of Raymond Williams. Go ahead, sorry.
Sir,
Tabassum,
please continue.
Do you have any questions for me?
No, sir, not at this point.
Okay. Let me see if other questions are.
So Dr. Mark Schwab, if you have any question or comment, please feel free.
Professor Schwab, I'm not sure if he's still there, but he was there. Oh, thank you, Mark. Thank you much for talking about my course there. You've written there, great course by Azfar. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Hussain. It's a pleasure to hear you. I haven't seen you in person in a long time, so it's great to see you in this lecture. Thank you for Ulab for sponsoring it.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So I think we can call it a day. There are no more questions, I feel. So should we wrap up, sir? Shamshad, sir?
Yeah, I think it's getting late for Dr. Hussain. And
Yeah. Yes.
I'm fine. Can I spend a little more time? I go to bed usually at 2 o'clock. So I think I'm doing all right.
That's abnormal, sir.
Okay.
Okay, so
you have normalized it. You
So
have
I'm
normalized that normal.
no. No, Shamsad, you will probably be normalizing it now, right?
All right, so this brings us to the end of the session, and let me take this opportunity to thank Dr. Azfar Hussain, who has always been there for Ulab. It only took me a text, and he agreed right away to do this for us, even at these ungodly hours. It must be past midnight in Michigan, right? So Azfar bhai, here is a big thank you from all of us at DEH, and I don't think that this could have been any better. I'm sure you have already, intrigued many of our students, and they are thinking about their projects right now. And also I would like to thank Shamshad sir. Despite the pandemic and all kinds of upsets, he continued, he pushed us to continue with the CI along with other co-curricular activities.
Oh, no, there's
you.
not. Okay, sorry. I saw another question. I didn't suggest that. It's from.
Would you like to take this? Yeah, you can go ahead.
That says that then I don't continue to suggest that even revolutionary ideas are byproducts of capitalism. They're not just simply byproducts of capitalism. Revolutionary ideas can be triggered, though, can be, revolutionary ideas do not fall from the sky. They are produced, in a given given space. And I think that capitalism might create conditions, for revolutionary ideas. This is something that Marx says, that it is a system that, creates these conditions of revolutionary politics. The system itself. So, so there might be those revolutionary moments within capitalism, but I don't call them just simply byproducts of capitalism as such. You see the point I'm trying to make? Muhammad Zahidul Islam, do you see the point? And if you want to disagree with me, that's fine. We can, debate this a little bit. Why not? No?
Is he here with us?
Zahidul is here. He written. Then you continue to suggest, as I understand, even revolutionary ideas are byproducts of capitalism. Not necessarily. There are revolutionary ideas, not necessarily byproducts of capitalism, but we won't use language like that, like byproducts, just, But capitalism can certainly, in order to tame the revolution, can pretend to be a little bit revolutionary too. Okay, Tabassum. All right.
I was just going to thank the people on my team for organizing this. So I was going to thank Shamshad sir for pushing us, and also for being so relentless in not cutting us any slack, pandemic or no pandemic. So thank you, sir, for being so cruel to be kind. Also, a special shout out to NASA and the IT team for the support system and who held the fort against all possible hiccups. And last but not the least, thanks to all my colleagues and dear students for, being with us on Saturday morning. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot from the session. And before we end, just a quick 2 announcements. Let me just remind you that this was our first forum on the topic. We will continue this discussion with Professor Firdaus Azim and explore more of the topic on the second forum scheduled on the 26th of November at 3 p.m. Mark your calendar. We will share the Zoom link with you closer to the date. And also there is another wonderful lecture coming up at 5 p.m. today by Shaukat Majumdar of Ashoka University. He would be talking about the invention of creative writing. So I invite all of you to join us as well, the Zoom. So thank you so much. And thank you and have a very good day. Thank you, everybody.
Just one thing, I'm writing something. Thank you, everybody. I miss Ulab.
We miss you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for everything. It was really, really interesting. And I'm sure, as Tabassum was saying, that they will have enough food for thoughts for their own projects.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope so. And if there is anything else, Tabassum, I can do in terms of clarifying issues, vis-a-vis student projects, you are very welcome to let me know.
How wonderful. We surely will reach out to you, sir. And so everybody, as you have heard, so if you have queries, just, through this my way, I will direct it to Azfar Bhai. Okay?
Sure.
Thank you so much, everybody.
And also, Professor Ian Almond will be speaking next week. So join us for that.
Oh, Ian Almond, I'm reading. By the way, Shamsad, could you be with me for a few minutes after this whole thing?
Sure,
just
sir.
a few minutes.
Absolutely.
I know.
All right, sir. Bye-bye from us. We will leave you.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. I'll be with Tabassum and Shamsad.
Guests from outside.
You want me
really
to stay?
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Shaila. Bye-bye. So, Nasir, I will send you the press release as promised.
Yeah.
So, Nasir needs the press release. Okay.
Very nice.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Sir, you want me to stay?
If you can, a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so you can stop recording, perhaps?
Yes.
Yeah, we can stop recording now.
Yusuf Bhai, you can stop recording.